Today I'm wrapping up my series reviewing Devil's Gate by David Roberts and talking about the Mormon handcart pioneers. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. Today I'm wrapping up my series reviewing the book Devil's Gate by David Roberts and talking about the Mormon pioneers. The day after this video comes out will be July 24th, and that is Pioneer Day, celebrated by Mormons all over the place, especially here in Utah, but usually wards everywhere around the world will celebrate it. So it was really important to me to get this series of videos out before Pioneer Day. And it's been really meaningful to me personally as someone who comes from pioneer ancestry, as I've watched kids start going out on trek this summer and people talking about pioneers as we get closer to Pioneer Day, knowing that most of them don't know a lot of this background information and don't even think about it, because they want to just be able to say the names, cry a little bit over the stories, be proud of this ancestry, and focus on the church instead of the people. And I don't think that fully honors these people, especially when you're saying the lie that nobody ever left the church that went through this. I'm going to touch on that today. In order to honor these people and what they went through, you need to be honest. And I am tired of the dishonesty in the LDS church. Frankly, it is really hard to immerse yourself in this and read people's journals and read books about people and learn about what they went through and know that people did leave the church and know that it was handled wrong and know that it has been used to push the narrative of the church forward, and know that you can't say anything, and know that the people that are celebrating this have no idea. It's really hard to watch. And so it is very important for me to put this out here. And so hopefully this is interesting to some of you. I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to, like I've said in the first video, I'm not trying to dishonor anyone. I'm not trying to dishonor any of my ancestors. I'm not trying to dishonor anyone else's ancestors. But I am saying that if I went through this, I would want people to know the full truth, no matter where they land on the truth claims of the church. Truth is important. And in today's world, I think we've lost truth in a lot of things. A lot of the narrative that comes out of Salt Lake City at this time that we've been reading about, that we've been talking about with Brigham Young sending rescuers out to go to the handcarts, you would think that maybe that was all that was on people in Salt Lake City's mind, is getting people here, getting the pioneers to Utah, and then, helping them on the way, helping them once they're here. But there was actually something else in Salt Lake City that Brigham Young was very worried about during this time. We'll have to go back in time a little bit. In the book, he has this right in the middle of the story of the pioneers, but I felt like it would be more appropriate to talk about it here in the last video. This is something that I had no idea existed until I read this book. There was a Mormon Reformation in Salt Lake City. So I'm going to read straight from his book about the beginning of this. Out of this climate of fear and righteous indignation was born what remains by all odds the strangest convulsion in LDS history. The Mormons themselves called it the Reformation. Its author was Young's second counselor, a 40-year-old man named Jedediah Grant. He was known to the faithful as the sledgehammer of Brigham Young, while he liked to style himself Mormon Thunder. More familiarly, the saints called him Jeddy. He describes the way historian David L. Bigler described Grant, and he said, behind the smile was an enigmatic figure, one untroubled by doubt, driven to enforce righteousness. This Reformation that it's going to talk about came out of kind of a trivial event. Grant was attending a church meeting in Kaysville, a small town here in Utah. It's about 25 miles north of Salt Lake City, and they invited some elders to come to the meeting. He had lent one of the men a mule. This man that he lent the mule to prided himself apparently on his riding skills, and so he set off for Kaysville at a full gallop. By the time he got there, the mule was very tired. Grant opened the meeting pleasantly enough as the various elders took turns offering testimonies of their faith. But when the sledgehammer rose to speak, he allegedly became quite excited and then proceeded to accuse everyone present of all sorts of wrongdoing. He denounced them for their inconsistency and hypocrisy. He bitterly upbraided them for running his own mule and their own beast in such a manner. He called upon everyone to repent and to do their first works over again, or the judgment of God would speedily overtake them. I could understand being mad at somebody who, if you lent them a mule of yours, if they ran it too hard and didn't take care of it. I don't think there's anything wrong with him calling out someone for that. He's calling them out for hypocrisy and everything. This says this sparked a wildfire that would quickly sweep across Deseret. Meetings followed weekly, during which the mutual accusations of those who were present became, if possible, more bitter than before. The saints were denounced as the vilest of sinners, and they were all commanded to be re-baptized. In the Mormon Church, baptism is believed to be a necessary action for salvation. And when you are baptized, it is also for a remission of your sins. It takes away every sin you've committed before that baptism. And after that, if you sin, you have to go through a repentance process. Getting re-baptized in the Mormon church, getting multiple times into the same church, doesn't seem to make sense. According to Fanny Stenhouse, the first baptisms occurred on a cold night during which Jetty not only immersed others with vigorous enthusiasm, but remained in the water so long he got a thorough chill. So he would suddenly die on December 1st, 1856 of typhoid and pneumonia. And in all probability, probably brought on by these nocturnal baptisms, he says in here. Young followed his sledgehammer's lead, though, and took up this banner, this purpose that Jetty had started. And in a speech on September 14th, just 12 days after the Ellsworth and MacArthur companies would roll into Salt Lake. So that was the very first two companies I talked about. So soon after they came in, he, quote, worked up the people with his tongue. And that is in the words of the apostle who summarized this for Deseret News. Young justly, strictly, and strongly chastised and rebuked the saints who formed his audience for lying, stealing, committing adultery, quarreling with husbands, wives, and children, and many other evils. And again, this is something that shocked me when I was reading it because, well, it's hard to shock me anymore about Mormon history because as I've learned about it, there's so many things I didn't know. Like in my history videos, if you watch those, we're given this presentation of Nauvoo, Illinois being this really pious community with people that were so well behaved. And then you find out that actually isn't what it was like at all. And so Salt Lake is the same thing. On July 13th, 1855, Grant had warned a Provo congregation that the church needs trimming up, and if you will search, you will find your wards contain branches which had better be cut off. In that speech, Grant first used the words by which the movement would come to be called. I would like to see the works of Reformation commence and continue until every man had to walk the line, he said. Some people see the roots of this also from the crop failures of 1855 and 1856, and that a lot of more devout Mormons believed that such punishments betoken not simply the ravages of grasshoppers, but divine retribution. So these grasshoppers, these failures, all of these things were actually consequences of their bad behavior. For weeks after the mass rebaptism, Grant addressed the congregation in the tabernacle every Sunday. According to one witness, the bishops were whipped for dereliction of duty, for being old fogies and not being strict in making the saints pay their tithing to the Lord. All were called upon to confess their sins and to make known to God's servant the crimes of which they were guilty. Individuals were hinted at and sins imputed to them which they dared not deny, nor even attempt to defend themselves, however innocent they may be. And on November 3rd, in dramatic fashion, Young added what would come to be known as the Catechism to the rhetorical thunder of the Reformation. Inside the social hall in Salt Lake City, he had the doors locked. Then he pulled from his breast pocket of his coat a long piece of paper. Reading from it aloud, he had a list of questions. 1. Have you shed innocent blood? 2. Have you committed adultery? 3. Have you betrayed your brother? 4. Have you borne false witness against your neighbor? 5. Do you get drunk? 6. Have you stolen? 7. Have you lied? 8. Have you contracted debts without prospect of paying? 9. Have you labored faithfully for your wages? 10. Have you coveted that which belongs to another? 11. Have you taken the name of the Lord in vain? 12. Do you preside in your family as a servant of God? 13. Have you paid your tithing in all things? This would later be expanded to also have the questions, do you pray in secret? And do you wash your bodies once a week? Of course, he writes in here that Brigham Young himself was obliged to confess that he sometimes failed to bathe once a week. Although most of these things are good things to not be doing, it became the text for their inquisition for this Reformation. A pair of church officials would visit every household and ask these questions, and probably other ones too, but they would ask these questions to the inhabitants under oath. If people answered the questions wrong, then they could be cut off from the church. The Mormon Reformation is often compared to the Salem witch trials, as at Salem, in Utah, brainwashed citizens confessed to sins that they were not in fact guilty of. At one all-male meeting in the social hall, according to an eyewitness, Young suddenly announced, "All who have been guilty of committing adultery, stand up." To his astonishment and chagrin, more than 3/4 of the congregation got to their feet. Now, were 3/4 of this congregation really committing adultery? I mean, technically they probably all were, because most of them were probably polygamists. Brigham Young himself obviously was, but they wouldn't look at that as adultery. The bizarre but logical consequence of the Reformation's focus on adultery was to touch off an epidemic of plural marriages. One scholar demonstrated that there were 65% more plural marriages during 1856 and 1857 than in any other 2 years of plural marriage being around. So what that sounded like to me is that there really was a lot of adultery, and the men realized, oh, I need to marry my mistress and she can be my plural wife. He writes, Young himself was fully aware that many wives in Utah felt only misery in having to share their husbands with other women, but he had little sympathy for their unhappiness. On September 21st, he announced that he would give all Mormon plural wives 2 weeks to decide whether or not to accept their fate with good cheer. If they decided to stay with their husbands, he said, they should keep the law of God and not murmur or complain. If not, I will set all at liberty, which means that he would grant them divorces and probably excommunicate them. On November 5th, 1856, the Deseret News published a psalm in praise of the Reformation written by W.G. Mills. It began, "The Reformation has commenced, all hail the glorious day," and contained 2 stanzas in it that celebrated polygamy. Now, sisters, list to what I say. With trials this world is rife. You can't expect to miss them all. Help your husband get a wife. Now, this advice I freely give, if exalted that would be. Remember that your husband must be blessed with more than thee. Then, oh, let us say, God bless the wife that strives and aids her husband all she can to obtain a dozen wives. Can you imagine sitting in church and hearing this song, and that it is your duty, that God will bless the wife that tries to help her husband get to a dozen wives? I don't know how any women stayed in this church. I really don't. This says, if the Reformation took on the character of a general inquisition, its most frightening aspect was the doctrine of blood atonement. This is where something comes in that I also didn't know about until the last couple of years. I have talked about on here before with Under the Banner of Heaven. This was the brainchild of Grant and Young, and the principle was first announced by the prophet and his second counselor in a meeting in the Bowery on September 21st, 1856. At this Bowery meeting, Young urged the saints not only to report on one another, but also to participate in the shedding of the blood to help people atone for their sins. So this says the audience clearly understood this to mean execution. Brigham Young asked, will you love your brothers or sisters likewise when they have committed a sin that cannot be atoned for without the shedding of their blood? Will you love that man or woman well enough to shed their blood? That is what Jesus Christ meant. Grant then elaborated on this doctrine in more lurid language, urging sinners to seek their own punishment. He advised the guilty to present themselves to the prophet and ask him to appoint a committee to attend to their case, and then let a place be selected and let that committee shed their blood. The sledgehammer continued, and you who have committed sins that cannot be forgiven through baptism, let your blood be shed, and let the smoke ascend, that the incense thereof may come up before God as an atonement for your sins, and that the sinners in Zion may be afraid. So this was the doctrine of blood atonement. So there have been church apologists and theologians that have argued that the blood atonement was never taught, that it didn't exist, and that even if it was, that they didn't do it. But he writes in here that it does seem likely that the mid-1850s witnessed a proliferation of real acts of terror on the part of the notorious Danites, Young's secret police. The president himself denied that any such band existed, but there are too many accounts of beatings, robberies, and assassinations carried out in the territory during these years to ignore the phenomenon. A few of those accounts were written by Danites themselves. In the past, when I've talked about the Sherlock Holmes book, A Study in Scarlet, that gives a really good picture of Utah during Brigham Young's time and the violence that these people had. That is what these people are. Among some of the most notorious was a man named Bill Hickman. He would later write a book called Brigham's Destroying Angel, and he would talk about the things that he did for him. Brigham sent me word to look out for him. I found him, used him up, scalped him, and took his scalp to Brigham Young. He took it and thanked me very much. By 1848, the phrase use him up already had long standing as Mormon shorthand for murder. So if you see that in any journals or accounts, that is what that would have meant. In this part of the book, he goes through a few different times when these assassins did things for Brigham Young, or I guess I should say allegedly for Brigham Young. But I'm not going to go through all of those. If you are interested, read this and pick up other books about it. I'm going to read this part where he says, the killings most often associated with the doctrine of blood atonement, a complicated chain of events about which historians still argue today, are known as the Parish Potter murders. They were triggered by the tragic fate of one of the handcart pioneers. On Christmas Eve, 1856, in an eastern suburb of Salt Lake City, a woman who had come by handcart to Zion allegedly committed suicide. She had taken her own life rather than be forced to marry the man that was the head of the household she was staying at since she got to Salt Lake. According to her, she was told that she would be denounced as a prostitute and refused food and shelter if she did not submit to this marriage. That's bad enough if that was the full story, but even at the time, there was suspicion that this was not a suicide, but a murder. That was the interpretation of William Parrish, living in Springville, a town 50 miles south of Salt Lake. Though a practicing Mormon, Parrish had heard about and been appalled by the doctrines of killing to save, or blood atonement. Parrish attempted to flee the territory under cover of darkness in March 1857. The guide he entrusted to lead him planned instead to march the three parishes into an ambush. In the ensuing gun battle and knife fight, William Parrish and his older son were killed, as was the treacherous guide, Gardner Potter, by mistake. No one was ever brought to trial for these murders. Whatever the reality of blood atonement as a practice rather than merely a doctrine, there is no gainsaying the fear and reclamation that the Reformation cast over Zion. That level of fear in Salt Lake that you see in A Study of Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, that is real. Mormon apologists want to downplay or deny these murders and emphasize the moral improvement, which is what I was always taught about Salt Lake City at this time. So one strategy for not dealing with the embarrassment of this time period is to ignore it and not teach it. Leonard J. Arrington, who was a historian of the church, in his 522-page book, Brigham Young, American Moses, he didn't mention blood atonement even once, and the Reformation itself only had one single sentence. During the Reformation of 1856, the saints got carried away by the hellfire and damnation sermons of Grant, George A. Smith, and others. He doesn't even mention the others as Brigham Young. In his sermons and letters, Brigham Young always used the metaphor of separating the wheat and the chaff. That is still something you hear a lot in Mormon circles. I think probably in a lot of Christian circles too, but in the Mormon church, I hear it a lot. That was something Brigham Young brought up again and again. The chaff was the apostates, the unwilling plural wives, the sinners of all stripes, and the merely faint-hearted, lazy, or unclean. The thresher ranged from disfellowship to excommunication to banishment to murder. And he writes, such a set of mind helps to explain Young's often cold-hearted attitude toward the handcart pioneers. Like the Reformation, the ordeal by handcart separated the wheat from the chaff. Those who backed out in Iowa City or Florence, those who despaired of finishing the trek, even those who collapsed and died along the trail were perhaps not worthy of Zion at all. So when I read about this Reformation and I was learning this for the first time, I really did wonder if any church sources that I could go to today would talk about it. One source that I've used over and over again are the Saints books. And again, these are books put out by the church. You can buy them at Deseret Book. They are very readable. The way they're written is very simple but interesting. So a lot of people are going to go buy them. A lot of them are going to buy them and put them on their shelf and never read them. But a lot of people are going to read them. And I wondered, does volume 2 of the Saints, that would be during this time period, does it talk about this Reformation at all? So I looked it up. I printed out chapter 17 in the book, The Folks Are Reforming. And I'm just going to read the part of this that does talk about it. Christmas passed, and the New Year's Day soon followed it. There was no excitement. Although the saints normally enjoyed large dances and parties during the holidays, church leaders had discouraged such festivities this year. The moral reformation Jedediah Grant had started the previous fall was still underway, and such celebrations were deemed inappropriate. We have forgotten ourselves and gone to sleep, laid aside our religion and gone to amuse ourselves with temporal things, John explained further. Recently called as the presiding patriarch of the church, an office his father and grandfather had held, 24-year-old John fully supported the Reformation, although his intense shyness kept him from joining other leaders in public preaching. Since September, church leaders had been rebaptizing penitent saints in any nearby pool of water, even if they had to break ice to do it. The first presidency, moreover, had instructed bishops to stop administering the sacrament in their wards until more saints were rebaptized and proved their willingness to keep their covenants. So then it goes on to say, to encourage righteousness, church leaders admonished the saints to confess their sins publicly at ward meetings. As they encouraged greater righteousness, church leaders called on more men and women to practice plural marriage. So that did get a sentence here. By the spring of 1857, Brigham Young and other church leaders were pleased with the saints' reformation and reinstituted the sacrament throughout the church. Yet some problems had arisen during the Reformation. Leaders had spoken harshly of apostates and locals who were not members of the church. Feeling intimidated, some people left the territory. Bishops, home missionaries, and church members also clashed sometimes when frequent home visits and public confessions proved embarrassing, disruptive, or intimidating. With time, church leaders began encouraging the interviews and confessions be done in private. Church leaders typically used moderate and uplifting language in their sermons to encourage the saints to do better. The Book of Mormon provided clear examples of how forceful preaching could inspire people to reform, however, and church leaders had often used extreme language that winter to call the saints to repentance. At times, Brigham and others had even drawn on Old Testament scriptures to teach that certain grievous sins could be forgiven only through the shedding of the sinner's blood. I have to stop right there because this paragraph of that book should be a red flag for anyone who reads it. It goes on. Such teachings harked back to the hellfire and brimstone language of Protestant revival preachers who tried to frighten sinners into reform. Were there Protestant reformer preachers that taught blood atonement? Brigham understood that he sometimes let his fiery sermons go too far, and he did not intend for people to be put to death for their sins. And then the end says, both Brigham's forceful preaching and his counsel for mercy were intended to help the saints repent and draw closer to the Lord. You could see just from that what I've talked about, that the church always minimizes its faults and its mistakes. There is a pretty famous quote online of Dallin H. Oakes, who is the first counselor right now in the church, saying the church offers no apologies. When you look at that pattern and how this time period, the way that they were looking at Brigham Young, of course, it is easy to see that they are not going to put the blame of what happened to these handcart pioneers onto Brigham Young. Of course, they're not going to. It always has to fall on someone else. Toward the end of this book, there's a chapter called The Mormon Mayflower. And in this, he shares a story of how he was in the Marriott Hotel in Salt Lake and saw some things that were of Marriott's ancestors. So if you don't know, the Marriott Hotel chain, they're owned by a Mormon. And that is why when you go to a Marriott hotel, there will be a Bible in the room, but also a Book of Mormon. He talks about how he saw false information on one of the plaques that were in this Marriott, and he brought it to their attention. And it took him a long time to get them to finally get the word to Marriott himself, and it was changed because of him finding this mistake. He says, after a century and a half of hindsight, having a handcart pioneer as an ancestor had been transformed from a semi-secret family tragedy into a badge of courage, and even beyond that into a seal of authenticity. It had become the Mormon Mayflower. The reason he's talking about that is because for a certain amount of time, they didn't talk too much about the pioneers, but now it really is. It is a badge of honor. We all have that feeling. I'm a true dyed-in-the-wool Mormon for having ancestry that is all pioneers. And what he's saying here is very true. One of his guides in the LDS archives, Artis Partial, told him, Mormons are proud of our pioneer ancestors. Most of us secretly feel that having ancestors who came by wagon is better than having ancestors who came by train. It's even better when your ancestors came by handcart. And of course, you're practically royalty if you can claim someone in the Martin or Willie companies. That is 100% true. That pioneer ancestry makes you feel that you're the epitome of what a Mormon is supposed to be. Having someone in the Willie or Martin handcart company immediately generates interest around Pioneer Day. After everything we've talked about, what happens next? For more than 2 decades, the handcart catastrophe of 1856 was swept under the Mormon rug. The death toll was minimized while Brigham Young insisted again and again that the 1856 immigration had proved that his plan was sound. To prove this, Brigham handpicked 70 missionaries to go back along the Mormon trail, pushing and pulling handcarts to Iowa City. The difference is that these were better than the handcarts that were originally used. It was not until 1878 that any survivor of the 1856 tragedy publicly disputed the official version. John Jacques, this was Patience Loader's brother-in-law, who wrote her letter into the newspaper publicly and called them out for not wanting to be handcart pioneers. He was the former associate of Franklin D. Richards, and he was no longer that zealot that he had been at the beginning. He published a 7-part memoir of the Martin Company's ordeal in the Salt Lake Daily Herald between December 1st, 1878 and January 19th, 1879. What Jean Jacques was mad about was that 22 years later, the church was still trying to get the money for the Perpetual Immigration Fund from these survivors. At the end of his 7th installment, he wrote, "In conclusion, I have a benevolent suggestion to offer. I may be blamed for it by some persons, but I cannot help that." And he had a proposal. It would be entirely proper for the president of the Perpetual Immigration Fund Company and his assistants to be asked to freely and fully cancel the indebtedness for passage of every member of this unfortunate and sorely tried immigrant company, and it would be righteous, beneficent, and graceful act for those gentlemen to readily accede to such a request. So he's asking them to forgive the debt of anyone who was in these handcart companies that went through this trouble. And we have no idea if they did or not. There's no record of whether his proposal was accepted or not. He recorded the suffering, the losses, and the horror of the Martin Company's trial by starvation and cold. He said, "This is the first time the story of this handcart expedition has been written from beginning to end, so far as I know. It was not done before, partly for the reason that for years after the journey was made, nobody wished to say or hear much about it, and those who were in the company cared to remember little of it. The affair was one of the most disagreeable things, like some hateful dream or dreadful vision or horrible nightmare, that people seem indisposed to refer to, but rather tacitly agree to forget as much as possible for at least a time." In the 1870s and 1880s, exposés written by apostates sometimes summarized the disastrous campaign. The most scathing account emerged in the pages of Anna Eliza Young, wife number 19. So Anna Eliza Young had been a polygamous wife of Brigham Young, and then she ended up becoming disgruntled and she wrote wife number 19. She devoted 2 chapters of her tell-all book to the handcart episode, announcing her thesis at the start. In the history of any people, there has never been recorded a case of such gross mismanagement as that of gathering the foreign saints to Zion in the year 1856. She also said it was one of the very worst blunders that the Prince of Blunderers, Brigham Young, ever made. And it really wasn't until the 1920s and 1930s that the Mormon pioneer history began to be glorified in the way we see it done today. In 1906, several survivors of the William Martin companies decided to organize a 50th reunion. They had to petition the church for permission to hold this gathering. It was held on October 4th, 1906 in the 14th Ward Assembly Hall in Salt Lake City. The tone of this reunion was not exactly cheerful, but they did have a fierce pride of what they had gone through and united in the way survivors do of these kind of things. It says from 1906 on, the survivors were formally united in the Handcart Veterans Association. But when Samuel Jones proposed the erection of a monument to those who had died along the handcart trail, church leaders became skittish. In a 1908 letter to Jones from the First Presidency, headed now by President Joseph F. Smith, nephew of Joseph Smith, founder of the church, those leaders insisted, but while we feel tenderly towards the handcart martyrs, we hesitate to give our consent to the erection of a monument in their honor, believing the time is hardly ripe for it. It is clear to us that this important suggestion of yours be deferred for the present. So there wouldn't be a monument for another 9 decades. To this day, Martin's diary, which scholars would give much to be able to read, has never been found. A persistent rumor has it that after Martin's death, the diary was consigned to flames. Historian Lydia Carter discusses this. Martin's wife later said that it was accidentally burned. In the 1930s, Kate B. Carter, an editor and chronicler for the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, published multi-volume miscellanies of memoirs and historical sketches under the title Heartthrobs of the West and Treasures of Pioneer History. These books were very upbeat and positive, and a rumor about Kate Carter is that she made it a regular practice to destroy any documents that came into her hands that didn't show the pioneers in that light. So anything that was unflattering of the church would be destroyed. That is speculation, but if that is true, then we will probably never see a lot of the diaries and things that would have really helped us to understand all of this time period. And that may be where Martin's diary went and what his wife meant by it being accidentally burned. David Roberts did the thing thoroughly. He obviously did his research with reading contemporary accounts, with reading other literature that's been put out, with reading diaries and source material, visiting the LDS archives, talking to Mormons and non-Mormons alike. But he also visited the sites that he wrote about in this book multiple times. He describes in here his visit to Martin's Cove, and there is a visitor center there. I visited there with my children, and he said, having spent considerable time in the LDS archives, I was prepared for the sanctifying platitudes with which the visitor center converted a needless tragedy into a saga of perseverance and faith. He talks about the sign at the entrance of the museum. In 1856, portions of the ground were made sacred by the sacrifices of a company of handcart pioneers who struggled through the snow of Wyoming en route to Valley of the Great Salt Lake. This is the story of those stirring events and the legacy of courage and faith wrought by all 10 companies of handcart pioneers. This visitor center is dedicated to honor their courage, faith, and triumphs in the face of terrible adversity. Like every Mormon site you go to, it's missionaries that run it, so they're going to be elders and sisters. They're there to try to give you any information that they can. He said the captions emphasize the persecution of the saints in the East and Midwest. They had chosen to head for Utah to thrive in a place free of injustice, bigotry, and malice. One panel acknowledged that the handcart plan was Brigham Young's scheme for saving money, but insisted in bold print, the poor welcomed less expensive travel. Moreover, the plan was received with rejoicing by needy saints in Great Britain and throughout Europe. It was the answer to fervent prayers. Likewise, the exhibits acknowledged a 17-pound weight limit for personal goods, including bedding and clothing. But then it says church immigration officials at Iowa City could not keep up with the demand for handcarts. I was beguiled and puzzled by the medley of pious obfuscation and frank admission of suffering that the museum presented. A glass case holding a day's ration of flour made vividly clear how little food the saints were forced to subsist on. One caption granted, children chewed rawhide to quiet their pains of hunger. Yet the rescue came across as President Young, true to his word. The Martin Handcart Company was found and saved. Most conspicuous by its absence was any count of the total number of dead in the Willie and Martin Handcart Company. The only retrospective quotations from survivors were blindly loyal ones, such as that of Francis Webster, 25-year-old pilgrim in the Martin Company in 1856, who said, "We came through with the absolute knowledge that God lives, for we became acquainted with him in our extremities. I knew that the angels of God were there." He said that there was a display of dominoes that showed all the different things that went wrong. And so the dominoes were labeled, left England late, many elderly and children, handcarts not built, frequent repairs to carts, carts, oxen lost in the storm, flour transferred to carts, clothes left to lighten the load, rations cut and then gone, cattle weaken and die, October 19th storm. He writes, so that was it. The whole handcart tragedy was the result of a bad alignment of dominoes. He goes on to talk about how at the visitor center they have all of the handcarts, and he said the church has purchased hundreds of handcart wheels built by Amish craftsmen in Pennsylvania and then used their own carpenters to build the boxes and yokes that complete the modern handcart. So when people are going on trek or when you go to these sites, that is the one you're using. You're using Amish made wheels on a carpenter built handcart. It's nothing like the handcarts that were really used. And he says that the modern handcarts are considerably bigger and heavier than the originals, but they also have the inestimable advantages of iron rims on the wheels, ball bearings in the hubs, and steel axles. The trail leading west from the visitor center is a dirt road, not the sodden track of 1856. Even along the gravel road, I was shocked by how hard it was to move my handcart. I alternated pushing and pulling, unable to get the hang of either. It bounced against my hips or my chest, depending on whether I grasped it with an underhand or overhand grip. He talks about how hard this was even with the better carts. So imagine how bad it was with the old carts. It was only 1.3 miles by the dirt road to the second visitor station, from which a paved walking trail loops up into the cove. It took me half an hour to cover that distance with my handcart, and I arrived sore and tired. He talks about a year later when he goes back again. He said that there's a group from West Valley, which is up in the Salt Lake Valley on the west side. And he said they're in their bonnets and their shawls, their bandanas, their pioneer dress. It was high 80s that day. One sister had worn 2 skirts to get into the spirit. He said the only discordant note in the women's apparel were the Nikes and Adidas that peeked out from below the hems of their skirts. The handcarts likewise carried the anachronistic freight of box lunches and coolers filled with Gatorade. He asked if he could join this group. He was invited to join them, and he went along with them. He goes through all the different things that they're saying at the different spots. One of the things that they say is, "This is sacred ground," one of the women said. "Hallowed by the pioneers. The Spirit will speak to you if you listen. Open your hearts and the Spirit will speak to you." And then they had a closing prayer. They moved on to Upper Cove. And he talks about one of the elders telling a story and then collapsing into a fit of weeping. But then without missing a beat, his wife takes up the baton and says, "I get to tell a love story." She tells this story. Sarah Franks and George Padley were engaged when they left England and planned to be married when they arrived in Salt Lake City and raised their family in Zion. George died at Martin's Cove, however, and Sarah was extremely ill and weak even before the grief she felt in George's death. Sarah survived the journey but had no relatives or friends to meet her. The woman added some embellishments, he said. Sarah couldn't bear the thought of the wolves getting to George. They hung his body from a tree to keep it from the wolves, and Sarah left her shawl with her fiancé. This is actually one of the stories that is told in the movie 17 Miracles. It shows their love story the whole time and how she refused to marry him until they got to Salt Lake so they could get married in the temple. And they make it out to be this hugely romantic thing. What they don't tell you in the movie is how she ended up coming to Salt Lake and becoming a polygamous wife of someone else. And I cannot help but think this is not that romantic of a story. She had a man she loved that she could have married and lived with somewhere else and raised a family and probably had a wonderful life. And instead, she lost him and became a polygamous wife to someone else. I don't understand what's romantic about that. In 17 Miracles, they mentioned that one of the leaders of the church wept when he heard this story. And so he sealed those two together in the temple so that they would be married in heaven. And the thing that people don't stop to think about when they hear that part of the story is that in Mormon theology, if you are sealed to someone, then your children are sealed to both of you. And she would have already been sealed to someone as a polygamous wife. So she would have had children with the man that she married in Salt Lake. So unless they divorced her from that man before they sealed her to George, which I'm assuming they would have had to do, because men can be sealed to more than one woman, but women can't be sealed to more than one man, her children would have still been sealed to their father, or they would have been sealed to her and George, and then that man wouldn't have had his children. It gets very convoluted when you start thinking of the afterlife with Mormon theology. So then a little later, he said, one of the West Valley women repeated the story about the 3 18-year-olds carrying the saints across the Sweetwater River, and that is something I talked about in the last video. He said, "I could not bite my tongue." "You know, that's a myth," I blurted out. "Chad Orton has written a paper that completely debunks the story. It didn't happen." This was not welcome news to the West Valley ward. An awkward silence ensued as I began to feel like a drunken guest at a party who has just committed some unforgivable faux pas. "How do we know what's really the truth?" asked Trish Ward in conciliatory tones. I started to utter some piety of my own about relying on authentic primary sources, but instead a young woman who had previously spoken not a word said, "Maybe we can pray." They are perpetuating a myth about the pioneers, and when he presents them with the truth, they have to shove it away really quick and say, "Oh, we don't know that that's true, and let's pray," instead of facing the truth and saying, "Wait, what?" and learning from it. On the next page, he's talking about how he was looking at some artifacts in the museum. The sister is telling about them, and he said, "Suddenly I couldn't take anymore." And I said, "But who was to blame?" it says that stopped her cold. Sister Willie's eyes seemed to bulge with incomprehension. Blame, she repeated. After all, I went on, more than 200 people died, but they came to know God, and not one of them ever left the church, she said. I fled without signing the guest register. So even the missionaries that are working at these pioneer sites, they believe that lie that I talked about being told, that none of the handcart pioneers ever left the church. And that is what people that go to these sites are going to hear from the missionaries. And it is not true. He said that later that day, he made his way by the back roads to Rock Creek Hollow, where the Willie Company had struggled into Grant's camp on October 23rd, 1856. And he said, to my surprise, the monument here, identifying the 15 who died that night and the next morning, had been erected way back in 1933. And for once, the motto on it just said, in memory of those members of the Willie Handcart Company whose journey started too late and ended too early. But then a far more grandiose granite monument, 100 yards to the south, commemorated the visits between 1992 and 1997 of the church's first presidency, Prophet Gordon Hinckley, and leading apostles Thomas Monson and James Faust. Under the boldly capitalized injunction for members, were graved the dates of their several visits, followed by a citation from the Book of Mormon, Helaman 10:4-5. The text in question was the Lord blessing Nephi for his good deeds, Nephi being the leader of the true saints, whose followers were wiped out by the Lamanites. Verse 5 begins, and now, because thou hast done this with such unweariness, behold, I will bless thee forever, and I will make thee mighty in word and in deed and in faith and in works. Not far from this granite memorial, a crude fence made of boards and cables enclosed a scattering of anonymous graves, marked not with headstones, but with piles of shale. I was left to wonder whether those were the actual graves of the 15 Willie saints who had died here, or the graves of later pioneers, or merely symbolic mounds evoking a tragic place. Whichever the truth, I found those mounds more moving than all the monuments, plaques, signboards, and museum captions, whose earnest legends I had read between the Visitor Center and Rock Creek Hollow. I think it's also interesting that the monument for the leaders of the church visiting is so much more grand and big than the monument for the people who died. He goes on, the courage and perseverance of most of the handcart saints are beyond question. Some of them, as well as some of the rescuers, emerged from the ordeal as genuine heroes. What seems to have been lost in the myth-making is the fact that those saints were also victims, and not of some domino topple of impersonal causes, but of colossal mismanagement and negligence on the part of the LDS leaders. For a people as devout as the Mormons, the question of why the handcart disaster happened takes on a deep significance. On my first visit to the Handcart Visitor Center, a docent named Elder Merrill, standing outside the museum, raised the question in its simplest form. Some people get upset when they come here. Why did the Father in Heaven let the handcart pioneers do that? But Merrill's answer, like that of most of his colleagues, was far too pat for me to swallow. The handcart saints had died, he insisted, to turn the trail into sacred ground. He has, in parentheses, on my 3 visits I'd heard and read that phrase ad nauseum. They had died in order to inspire today's saints to improve their lives, particularly youth. According to Elder Merrill, kids come here leading troubled lives. Some aren't even in the church. They go home and get baptized. They say it changed their lives forever. So they had to die to inspire us today. He also tells the story, passed around a lot, of a man who said that as they were pushing the handcart, putting one foot in front of the other, they would look back and feel like somebody else was pushing, and they knew the angels of God were helping them push these handcarts. And that could have been something somebody really felt. However, the way it's told is as if the person that told it wrote it out. But it actually was a man later on retold the story of hearing somebody say that. David Roberts says that he wasn't surprised to find the story of that attributed not to Palmer's reminiscence of somebody saying it, but to Francis Webster himself. And we don't know if he really said that. He says the oft-repeated claim that no veteran of the Willie and Martin companies ever apostatized is easily refuted, starting with such prominent sub-captains as John Chislett and John Amundsen, and extending to such ordinary saints as Elizabeth Sermon. Because of the spotty record, the actual number of survivors who left the church is impossible to calculate. According to Lyndia Carter, substantial members of the Hunt and Hodgett wagon companies, especially women, later apostatized. Records show that they went back east or to England, says Carter, and there were dropouts in Iowa City and Florence. In general, among all the saints who came to Utah in the pioneer years, about 1/3 ended up leaving the church. And Brigham liked to say that only 1/3 of the pioneers were worth keeping, and another third weren't worth the salt, and a further third left. He then goes on to quote a poem from Robert Frost called The Draft Horse, and uses it to illustrate how the handcart pioneers are used to further the church's purpose. That God must want them to learn something infinitely valuable from this suffering, and that the greatest disaster was transformed from a campaign so terrible that no one wanted to talk or write about it into the Mormon Mayflower. In the last decade and a half, the retrospective gilding of tragedy with moral uplift has reached its frenzied zenith, he writes. That transformation goes beyond such shrines as the Handcart Visitor Center. So he talks about a film called In Their Footsteps, Steps of Faith, the story of the Willie and Martin handcarts. And he said that the film reckons the toll of the dead in the Martin Company alone is 156, but reassures us that the survivors almost all remained in Salt Lake, stronger in faith with proven courage and dedicated to the church lifestyle. He then visited This Is the Place monument that I've talked about. And he writes, I decided to take 3 days to traverse the trail from Salt Lake City to eastern Wyoming, retracing by automobile in reverse the latter half of the Martin and Willie Company's journey, and also seeking out those odd locales where the dire and momentous events of a century and a half before were commemorated by no plaques or visitor center. My trip began at This Is the Place Heritage Park on the northeastern outskirts of Salt Lake. The park, named after the most famous pronouncement Brigham never uttered, is dominated by a 60-foot tall pylon atop which the prophet stands, flanked by his 2 faithful apostles, Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Woodruff. And so he's seeing firsthand this huge monument to Brigham Young and his counselors. Why isn't the biggest monument at that park the pioneers themselves? In the chapter, A Day of Reckoning, he returns to the men that were left behind. If you remember me talking about the men that were tasked to stay behind and guard the supplies of the Martin, Hunt, and Hodgett companies over the winter. And these men had a rough winter. They were warned not to go too far out of their camp because of the danger of Indians. And the ironic thing about that was that Indians ended up saving their lives by bringing them food. And so he tells a little bit more about what happened to them. Finally, in the late spring, the long-awaited relief train arrived, carrying a ton of flour and other provisions. These blessed emissaries also brought startling news that a party of more than 50 apostates fleeing Salt Lake City was close on their heels. In the debate about how many of the handcart immigrants later apostatized, this crucial passage in 40 years among the Indians seems to have been overlooked by historians. The apostate exodus, Jones makes clear, included quite a number of saints from the Martin, Hunt, and Hodgett companies. The goods we were guarding belonged to the last season's immigrants. Some of the owners had become dissatisfied with Mormonism and were going back to the States. As their goods had not arrived in Salt Lake City, they demanded that they should be delivered at Devil's Gate. Quite a number settled their freight bills and brought orders for their goods and received them all right. Others refused to settle, but threatened that if the goods were not given up, they would take them by force. Jones recounts the ensuing showdown as a classic dime novel drama, with his allies stationed inside the fort, their rifles cocked and aimed through portholes in its walls, as he himself faces down the angry leader of the apostate throng. And so Jones told these apostates that they'd been there all winter and just try them, that they're not going to give up. And so the apostates back down and no blood is shed. Whether the disillusioned saints abandoning Zion ever received their belongings, the chronicler does not say. Jones's account proves that a sizable number of apostates among the last 3 1856 parties turned their backs on Mormonism only months after arriving in Salt Lake City. But it also makes clear another condition of their plight, that on top of their debt to the Perpetual Immigration Fund, the always dollar-conscious Brigham Young expected the handcart pioneers to pay freight bills to recover the very belongings the handcart plan itself had made them too weak to carry beyond Devil's Gate. By early summer of 1857, these men that had stayed there were able to go back to Salt Lake City. It says if Jones expected to be greeted as a hero, he was in for a rude shock. In his absence, he learned strange stories had been put into circulation about him. He was accused of stealing and hiding away thousands of dollars worth of goods for his trouble. And so now he's going to go on to more about what happened in Salt Lake. Even before the last 2 handcart companies arrived in Salt Lake City, Young launched a strenuous campaign to minimize the disaster. The prophet himself never publicly reckoned the number of dead in the Willie and Martin parties. Instead, he found ingenious ways to imply that the toll was not very high. Speaking in the Tabernacle on November 16th, when the Martin Company was limping across Rocky Ridge, still 260 miles and 2 weeks away from Salt Lake, the prophet reassured his congregation. Try to think back to the last 2 videos and when I had them at Rocky Ridge where so many people died. Brigham Young said this: Count the living and the dead, and you will find that not half the number died in Brother Willie's handcart company, in proportion to the number in that company as have died in past seasons by the cholera, in a single company traveling with wagons and oxen. With regard to those who have died and been laid away by the roadside on the plains since the cold weather commenced, let me tell you, they have not suffered 1/100th part so much as did our brethren and sisters who have died with cholera. He also painted the most romantic picture possible of death on the Wyoming plains. I should be pleased when the time comes if we could all depart from life as easily as did those brothers and sisters. I repeat, it will be a happy circumstance when death overtakes me if I am privileged to die without a groan or a struggle while yet retaining a good appetite for food. I speak of these things to forestall indulgence in a misplaced sympathy. That misplaced sympathy, of course, was not so easily squelched from the streets of Salt Lake as they were coursing with scuttlebutt about a colossal mismanagement of the handcart migration by the prophet himself. Young deflected the blame in his fiery oration of November 2nd when he scapegoated Franklin Richards and Daniel Spencer for letting the last 2 companies leave Florence too late in the season. There should be blame on Franklin Richards and any of the other leaders that didn't listen to the people, but you know that they also were listening to their prophet. Within weeks of the arrival of the last immigrants in 1856, the prophet was baldly asserting the soundness of the handcart plan. Like I said a little while ago, he arranged for a bunch of missionaries to make this journey in the span of 48 days, averaging almost 22 miles a day, to prove that it could be done and that it wasn't the handcart plan that was the problem. And this mission was a vindication to him of his divine handcart plan. Yet, as historian Will Bagley was the first to point out, an eyewitness account of the missionary's journey flatly contradicts the Florence newspaper's jaunty boast. On his own way from Salt Lake City to Chicago, Chauncey Webb overtook the handcart train at Devil's Gate. Webb had been the master carpenter who had superintended the building of the 1856 handcarts in Iowa City, and his had been the sole voice arguing against the launching out from Florence of the Martin Company in late August. The account of Webb's observation of the missionaries appears in the pages of his daughter's wife, number 19. And he was alive when the book was published, so if he had objected to her misrepresenting him, as some people say it's misrepresented, then he would have been able to say that. According to Annalisa Young, at Devil's Gate, her father found the handcart missionaries completely jaded and worn out. In truth, they were almost dead from weariness. They traveled slowly, making long stops to rest, and finally they reached the Missouri River in a perfect state of exhaustion. They left their carts there with the utmost willingness. To this day, they all aver they cannot bear to hear the word handcart mentioned. Meanwhile, Young was busy organizing 2 more handcart expeditions to bring European and British saints to Zion in the summer of 1857. Eventually, they would be complemented by a single handcart train in 1859 and 2 more in 1860. In all, then 10 handcart caravans crossed the plains between 1856 and 1860. The fact that none of the subsequent 5 suffered a major disaster has solidified the myth that the handcart plan was fundamentally sound and that the problem didn't lie in the handcart's plan itself. Andrew Olson, in The Price We Paid, argues that the William Martin catastrophe should not be seen as an indictment on the handcart plan. 3 companies before them made the journey successfully, and 5 companies after them would do the same. But the LDS archives tell a different story. They are full of the same kinds of heart-wrenching testimonies to exhaustion and near starvation as the more oft-quoted Willie and Martin sources. Thus, in the 1857 company led by Israel Evans, Robert Fishburne complained, "We could not help but feel that somebody was at fault for the scanty supply of provisions furnished us." Of the same expedition, Susan Whitbeck remembered 40 years later, "There could not have been a more difficult mode of travel. We would push and pull these carts across more than 1,000 miles of trackless plains, barren desert, and towering mountains. I knew when I left England that ours was to be a handcart company, but it was impossible for me to realize the hardships I had to meet." In the second 1857 company, led by Christian Christiansen, 20-year-old Kirsten Erickson, who left her parents and grandmother behind in Florence, recalled, "About the 5th day out, I was so worn out pulling over the rough roads, up hills, and through the sand, and discouraged because I did not believe I could stand the journey. And I came to the conclusion that I might as well die there as suffer longer. And I was lonely, for I had no relatives in the company. So I purposely stayed behind while the company were traveling and laid down in the grass, expecting to die there." Captain Christiansen discovered the young woman and rallied her to continue the journey. My painter ancestor I've talked about, he was in that company. And some of the quotes from him, he talks about how their first trials that they had to give up books. "We were only allowed to take 15 pounds in weight for each person who was to travel with the handcart, and that included our tinware for eating, bedding, and any clothing we did not wish to carry ourselves." By the church's sources, the Christiansen Company had 330 people, and the death rate they said was 6 ? Which would be 1.8%. But that question mark means that they don't know that that's actually the amount of deaths that they had. And he says there is good evidence that the death toll among the last 5 handcart expeditions had been seriously undercounted by Mormon historians. In those 5 companies totaling 1,071 people, only 12 deaths were recorded. And yet the Christiansen expedition is the most sketchily documented among all 10 handcart companies, largely because most of its members were Scandinavian, like my ancestor. Yet 2 participants in the party later swore that 1/10 of the company died for want of care and nourishment. Since 330 immigrants set out from Iowa City in the Christiansen Company, that rate of attrition would put the death toll in the vicinity of 33, not 6 ? Will Bagley calculates the death rate among all 10 handcart companies at 10% versus a rate of 4% among all Mormon wagon companies. There were more than 2 handcart disasters. There were 10 handcart disasters, plus the comedy that the handcart missionaries staged in the spring of 1857. Evans was number 6, Christiansen was number 7. The 8th handcart company was the Rowley Company, which also had a question mark. They had 5 question mark deaths. One of my ancestors, Jane Carter Harris Robbins, she and her husband William Morton Harris were supposed to actually be in the Willie Company, but then luckily they stayed behind and worked for a while. They ended up in the Raleigh Company. She said, "At Devil's Gate, scanty provisions were distributed, having arrived there on the 12th of August. All were aware that they could be facing starvation if the requested supplies from Salt Lake did not arrive soon." She talks about multiple deaths in her remembrance of it. The 9th Handcart Company was the Robinson Company with 233 people. They have listed as only 1 death. And the 10th Handcart Company was the Stoddard Company with 124 people, which they list as 0 deaths. In his chapter, A Day of Reckoning, he talks about what happened to some of the pioneers after they got to Salt Lake. One of the stories talks about a woman named Nellie who ended up having to lose her feet just to end up in Cedar City, where she became a plural wife. She raised 6 children. She helped support the family by taking and washing and knitting stockings. She died in 1915 at the age of 68. William Palmer, the same man who talked about the guy saying that there were angels pushing the handcarts, he said this, "In memory, I recall her wrinkled forehead, her soft dark eyes that told of pain and suffering, and the deep grooves that encircled the corners of her strong mouth. But in that face there was no trace of bitterness or railings at her fate. There was patience and serenity, for in spite of her handicap, she had earned her keep and justified her existence. She had given more to family, friends, and to the world than she had received." In 1991, a bronze statue of Nellie Unthank was erected on the campus of Southern Utah University in Cedar City. It depicts Nellie as a young girl who still has her feet. With a radiant, uplifted face, she dances on her toes, arms outspread, fingers extended in joy. The dedicatory ceremony was attended by the governor of Utah and by LDS President Gordon B. Hinckley. And he goes on, there's more and more stories in here. And then he says, more than a century and a half after the handcart expedition of 1856, it remains an elusive challenge to affix responsibility for the greatest disaster in Western migration history. The toppling dominoes on display at the Mormon Handcart Visitor Center do not give an adequate answer. Despite his many retrospective claims that he had always counseled against too late a departure from Florence, Brigham Young, in fact, never dictated firm cutoff dates until after the catastrophe. In the light of history, Young's public scapegoating of Franklin Richards and Daniel Spencer to deflect blame away from himself was a brilliant stroke. A century and a half later, the blame has stuck where the prophet slung it. A century and a half later, the prophet is widely viewed by Mormons as the hero of the handcart story. An independent scholar living in Salt Lake City, Will Bagley grew up Mormon but became disillusioned with the church early on. He said, "I have a deep and passionate connection to this story. 15 of my 16 great-grandparents crossed the plains to Utah, one of them in 1857. Concentrating on what he calls the prophet's obsessive penny pinching, Bagley takes the tack of analyzing the handcart saga in economic terms. In the 1850s, according to Bagley, Brigham had squandered hundreds of thousands of church dollars on failed developmental schemes. These were based on importing industrial machinery to manufacture iron, sugar, pottery, paper, wool, and salt. After the LDS Church, or more exactly Brigham Young, took over managing these enterprises, it lost $12,000 invested in pottery in 1853, at least $8,500 spent on a paper mill by 1857, and more than $100,000 on the failure of the effort of the damn miserable company, the Deseret Manufacturing Company, to make sugar from beets in 1856. By the time it folded in 1853, the Deseret Iron Company had made direct expenditures of at least $150,000 to produce nothing more than a few andirons, kitchen utensils, flat irons, wagon wheels, molasses rolls, and machine castings. At the same time that his schemes were threatening to bankrupt the church, Bagley argues that the prophet had amassed a personal fortune worth more than $150,000. The great appeal of the handcart plan was economic, to gather thousands of foreign-born saints to Zion at a fraction of the cost of bringing them in wagons. Yet so poor were those working-class converts from Britain and Europe that the perpetual emigration fund sank deeper and deeper in debt. Shockingly, Young blamed the poor themselves. In an angry speech, he told his Salt Lake congregation, "It is the poor who have got your money, and if you have any complaints to make them against the Almighty for having so many poor. I do not owe you anything. I cannot chew paper and spit out banknotes." He talks about some of the schemes that Brigham Young had. Like I said, not much shocks me, but this still surprised me. So this is something I didn't see coming. This involved the procurement of a gigantic and ultimately useless steam engine. In early 1855, the prophet ordered Apostle Erastus Snow to buy an engine in St. Louis and ship it overland to Salt Lake. The ultimate purpose of the contraption remains uncertain, but Bagley believes it was intended to power a steamboat to navigate the Great Salt Lake. Snow purchased an engine weighing 13,000 pounds. It was loaded in pieces into 5 separate wagons. A church train under Isaac Allred lugged the burden to 30 miles west of the Missouri River, where the team gave up and deposited the steam engine in a farmer's yard. Furious, the prophet ordered another party under Abraham Smoot to retrieve the engine and get it to Salt Lake City during the summer of 1856. This new train labored mightily to perform the task. In western Wyoming, Smoot's team met and interacted with the rescue party looking for the Willie and Martin handcart companies. Finally, Smoot too gave up on the debilitating job and cached the cumbersome baggage at Fort Bridger. So this steam engine has now been placed at Fort Bridger. This only further infuriated Brigham. Incredible though it may seem, the prophet ordered some of the rescue teams to divert their resources from saving handcart immigrant pioneers to gathering up the freight at Fort Bridger. Anyone who's watching this that wants to believe that didn't happen, proof of these orders is preserved in the LDS archives. Thus, in a report filed on the Capitol on December 12, 1856, Caleb Grant, a member of Smoot's team, wrote, "On November 3rd, we met an express from the governor stating that someone was to return and bring on from Bridger the wagon and freight we had left there, as well as several useless and tired out cattle left there by us." Another member of Smoot's team, Franklin Woolley, recorded, "At Fort Bridger, we left 8 wagons and their loads, as it was impossible for our team to take them all. When at the mouth of Echo Canyon, Brother Smoot received a letter from Brother Young directing him to bring all the goods in, if he had not enough team to call upon the brethren who were out in the mountains with ox teams. The Woolley Company was made aware of this diversion of teams to haul freight instead of save lives, for on November 4th, William Woodward recorded in the company's official journal, Franklin B. Woolley came on from A.O. Smoot's train, informing the company that President B. Young had sent word that some freight still lying at Fort Bridger was to be brought in this season, and that some teams and men of our company were needed to go on to Bridger. Several teams and men were selected for the trip." Bagley wrote, "Exactly what Young intended to do with a steamboat on the Great Salt Lake is not clear. It might have been part of an ambitious plan to transport coal from Sanpete County across Utah Lake and down the Jordan River. It may be that the prophet had no clear idea what he wanted to do with the contraption, for on March 1857, Young sent the engine south to the iron works at Cedar City, where, like the many crippled handcart veterans he dispatched to the remote settlement, it would be out of sight. The machinery replaced 2 existing 30-horsepower engines that had arrived a year earlier, but had not worked well. Later that year, the Deseret Iron Company paid Brigham Young $2,181 for the engine." Bagley grants that Franklin Richards sending on the last 2 handcart parties from Florence was the key blunder in the tragedy, but in his view, the whole debacle was caused not by mismanagement on the part of officials in Liverpool, New York, or Iowa City. It was a classic case of top-down bungling. Brigham Young was almost solely responsible for designing the immigration of 1856 and for setting in motion the machinery that would send almost 2,000 saints from Liverpool to Iowa City and thence by handcart to Zion. But once this ambitious campaign was launched, the prophet, quite uncharacteristically for the habitual micromanager, seemed to lose track of the details. Young knew full well by July 30th that there were more than 1,000 handcart saints who crossed the ocean on the Thornton and the Horizon, preparing to set out from Iowa City in the Willie and Martin companies. If this story couldn't get any worse, I think that is to know that he took away from the rescue to get a steam engine. So he goes on in here to say that if there is anyone in this story that is a leadership role of the church, not one of the members of the companies, that was a hero, it would be John Taylor. And he writes, the reason for that is that having ignored all the warning flags hoisted by Taylor over the months, on October 30th, as the disaster began to loom on the Salt Lake horizon, the prophet wrote an angry letter to Taylor, scolding him for not better superintending the immigration. And for the first time, Young blamed others, in this case Taylor, for the lateness in setting out of the last 1,000 immigrants. Young's harshest criticism, however, was an attack on Taylor as fiscally irresponsible. "We feel gratified at the exertions you have made, but you are aware, Brother Taylor, that we do not hold in very high estimation your financial talent and ability. You must not blame us for this, as we do not attach any to you, believing it to be a natural weakness. But you must excuse us for not wishing to pay $2 or $3 extra for each passenger." For Taylor, this must have been a last straw. In February 1857, he sent the prophet a letter that came as close to criticism as any high church official would get away with during Young's lifetime. He wrote, "On the death of Brother Spencer and the absence of Brother Snow, without being able to obtain communication from you, I knew that the responsibility rested somewhere. I would give $500 for a 5-minute conversation with you. You must here excuse me, Brother Young. I may be obtuse, and so may those who are with me, but however plain your words might be to yourself on this matter, neither I nor my associates can understand them." And then he added, "The handcart system was to me and to all of us a new operation. I considered that the utmost care and prudence was necessary. I wanted, if a train started, to know that it would go through. I knew of the weakness and infirmity of many women, children, and aged persons that were calculated to go. I did not consider that a few dollars were to be put in competition with the lives of human beings." I think that anyone who says that Brigham Young should not be blamed for this doesn't understand what really happened. What should Brigham Young's real legacy be when it comes to his handcart pioneers that he is given the status of hero for? A consistent theme throughout the 33 years of Young's tenure as prophet is what we would regard today as the undervaluing of human life. Apostates who wanted to flee Zion were better off dead. Young found himself virtually incapable of admitting that he was wrong or had committed a mistake. He never acknowledged the handcart disaster for the tragedy it was. And he says a modern psychologist might call it denial, a good Mormon would call it faith. And as I've mentioned on here many times in this series and in other videos I've made, this has not changed. This has not changed in the slightest bit with church leaders. They've always been this way. He said, Young's State of the Union address, disseminated to all of Zion on December 10th, 1856, this season's operations have demonstrated that the saints, being filled with faith in the Holy Ghost, can walk across the plains, drawing their provisions and clothing on handcarts. The experience of this season will, of course, help us to improve in future operations, but the plan has been fairly tested and proved entirely successful. Some of his critics have talked about that he was, in fact, a victim of himself, a victim of his own history, and that he was always living with the fear that he couldn't do what Joseph Smith had done. His biographer, Morris Werner, in 1925 said, "It is my conviction that without Brigham Young, the Mormons would never have been important after the first few years of their institutional life. But without the Mormons, Brigham Young might have been a great man." So David Roberts concludes this book this way: "I must conclude that far from being a hero of the handcart saga, Brigham Young was the architect of an immigration plan so ill-conceived that it had built into it the fatal flaws, chiefly the 17-pound baggage limit and the ration of a pound per day of flour, that would lead to unbearable hardships and scores of death. And further, that in failing competently to supervise the immigration once he had set it in motion, or even coherently to delegate that supervision, the prophet compounded a disaster that has no parallel in American history. I have to conclude that the 1856 handcart debacle was the worst blunder of the prophet's long career, worse in terms of human suffering even than his championing of polygamy, a diehard clinging to a hopeless cause that delayed Utah statehood until 1896 and helped bring the territory to the brink of war against the United States. The most pernicious of all the myths about the handcart campaign, a myth still cherished every summer by the throngs of reenactors who flocked to the Mormon Handcart Visitor Center in western Wyoming, is that because they came to know God, all the tribulations of the saints in the Willie and Martin companies were worth it. That myth effectively annuls the terrible realities of starving to death, dying from exposure to cold, and of incurring frostbite so severe as to cripple one for life. It is a testament to the power of myth to rationalize senseless evil that many of the saints in the Willie and Martin companies apparently subscribe to that justification for their own suffering." A few voices still ring out in protest, though. John Bond, the 12-year-old in the Hodgett's Wagon Company, conjured up decades later the untold hardships, broken hearts, and so many deaths of loved one he witnessed along the trail. Whatever was on the agents' minds, he wondered aloud, before saying, "The men in high standing with high priesthood power are yet to meet the innocent ones before the bar of God to answer to him for the atrocities of inhuman advice." And John Chislett, who you'll remember was one of the sub-captains of the Willie Company, mused upon the tragedy for a decade and a half before writing in the early 1870s whether Brigham was influenced in his desire to get the poor of Europe more rapidly to Utah by his sympathy with their condition, by his well-known love of power, his glory in numbers, or his love of wealth, which an increased amount of subservient labor would enable him to acquire, is best known to himself. But the sad results of his handcart scheme will call for a day of reckoning in the future which he cannot evade. You would think with so much proof of how badly this was handled that the truth would be out there more. So how is this still handled today? I pulled off a lot of articles off of the LDS Church website. I looked at lessons that are taught in church in Sunday school, young men, young women, primary. I looked at lessons that are taught in seminary, in the high schools and junior high where the teenagers are being taught. These are the things that are asked in the lessons on pioneers. Did you ever hear a survivor of the company utter a word of criticism? If we endure suffering faithfully, we can become acquainted with God. What types of attitudes or behaviors have you seen in those who have endured suffering faithfully? In what ways have you become acquainted with God through the trials you face? They tell stories of some of the people in these companies and then say, what is one purpose for our suffering and sacrificing for the gospel's sake? What ways might you have to suffer for the gospel's sake? In the gospel topics on handcart companies, the language is used the way I've talked about on here a lot. Most handcart companies made the journey without major incident. It talks about the companies that came to help them and saved over 1,200 lives, and the fatality rate of the other handcart companies did not exceed that of wagon companies. The origins of handcart travel topic. The handcarts with wheels as far apart as normal wagon wheels were constructed of wood, usually Iowa oak or hickory. There were regular carts and slightly larger family carts. The larger family carts often had axles of iron rather than of hickory. The captains of handcart companies were as rugged as they were faithful and all had considerable trail experience. That is one article on the LDS Church website. They're saying the handcarts are put together in a way that they weren't, but then they're also making sure that they point out that the people leading the handcarts had a lot of experience. However, then in handcart travel and evaluation on the same exact church website, it says, and were it not for the inexperience of the immigration officials coupled with a capricious climate, the storms were unseasonably early, the entire venture would have been counted as an unmarred success. So they have just said that they were experienced, and then in the next article it says that they were inexperienced. And that was the reason it's a problem. Their success demonstrated President Young's handcart plan, while demanding, was an effective way to move large groups at minimal cost over a long distance. Certainly there was an element of risk to handcart travel. Very Very few express bitterness. And then they say, while sometimes it's said that no one in the Martin Company ever apostatized or left the church, the statement does require qualification. Almost all retained a vibrant faith in the gospel, and for some, the ordeal resulted in their gaining the absolute knowledge that God lives, for we became acquainted with him in our extremities. They do say that that statement needs qualification, but they don't qualify it. They don't tell you how many did leave. They just go on to say almost all retained their faith. In a 1970 General Conference address, President Gordon B. Hinckley movingly recounted the experience of his wife's grandmother, Mary Ann Goebel Pay, who at the age of 13 left England with her family and ultimately joined up with the Martin Handcart Company. Before the journey's end, she lost 2 brothers, a sister, and finally her mother, who died just before they reached the valley. Years later, in her personal history, Sister Pay reflected on the spirit that prompted her family to become handcart pioneers. I have thought often of my mother's words before we left England. Polly, I want to go to Zion while my children are small so they can be raised in the gospel of Christ, for I know this is a true church. Mary Ann Goebel Pay, of course, made it to the valley. Others did not. Blessed be the names of all of them. Those who came to the west by handcart and those who sacrificed their all found joy and peace promised to the saints who endure suffering for the Savior's sake. The story of their tragedies and triumphs and their legacy of courage and convictions will never die. I had a lot of problems with that story when I was reading it. First of all, if the mom's wish was that she wanted to raise her children in Zion while they were still small, and that was the only reason they became pioneers and came here, but then she died along the way, she didn't get to raise them here. And so I don't know why that's that uplifting. Also saying they did this suffering for the Savior's sake, but Jesus didn't ask them to do this. And then in the era of handcarts, it says the benefits of President Young's plan were apparent with the arrival of the first 2 groups consisting of just under 500 immigrants. It had been a strenuous but safe journey, and you'll remember me talking about that one. The first presidency met the dusty and bedraggled but fulfilled pioneers at the mouth of Immigration Canyon. Within 1 week, a third group of some 300 Welsh saints arrived, led by Captain Edward Bunker. They completed the journey without undue hardship. That begs the question, what is due hardship? And then altogether, the first 3 companies had completed the journey from Iowa City to Salt Lake City in less time with equal or possibly fewer casualties than the typical wagon train. They know that's not true. President Young was stunned. He had thought the last 2 companies would winter at winter quarters. So they're perpetuating that. How could this have happened? With the advantage of historical hindsight, it's relatively easy to pinpoint problems along the way. It says well-intentioned but inexperienced leaders. So again, they're saying inexperience after having said experience. And then they say that Willie Martin immigrants became President Young's top priority. And after learning about the steam engine, that can be questioned as well. The Martin Company, with some 576 people, many of them elderly, was in an especially pitiful condition, some of them seemingly having lost all verve and direction. There was a certain gallantry, however, that attended the unspeakable horror. Regarding the Willie Martin experience, heroic status should be attached to at least 3 different clusters of people. First, of course, we must look to the handcart pioneers themselves, as a noted historian praised their human kindness and helpfulness and brotherly love in the midst of raw horror. By and large, those who died with dignity and faith. Who didn't? Second, we must recognize the rescue parties who risked life and limb to save their fellow saint. Their contribution cannot be overestimated. Without rescue parties, there would probably have been no survivors. And third, we must honor the resident saints in the valley who cared for the immigrants, sharing liberally of their modest and, in some cases, almost depleted stores of food and supplies. I was happy to see that they didn't say Brigham Young in those 3. And that part I will agree with them on. The people that did help people when they got here, the rescuers that went out and risked their lives to help, and the people themselves that were on this trek, those should be the ones that are remembered. Those are the ones that should have the big monuments. Those should be the ones that are talked about as heroes. They shouldn't make up stories that didn't happen. They shouldn't make tragic stories into stories of faith to push forward the gospel that they want to. But they should be honoring the people that made the sacrifice. But as you can see, it is constantly minimized and romanticized to this day. And I'm going to read another quote from this book about Gordon B. Hinckley. So on page 82, he says, "In that sacred and hallowed house, there passed through my mind a sense of the tremendous obligation that was mine to pass on all that I had received as an inheritance from my forebears to the generations who have now come after me." And I would say that this is one of the biggest reasons that these stories are built up the way that they are. And I'm going to get to this again in a minute, but we have an obligation put on our shoulders as members of the church that we can't leave because we owe something to our pioneer ancestors that gave so much for this church. Leaders caused this problem, and now they get to use it and use the miracles that did happen for their gain. for the church's gain. In the movie 17 Miracles that I've talked about quite a few times, I think that they did a really good job of showing some of the really hard things that happened, showing the state of the pioneers when they were in the storms and toward the end. I know they left out a lot of things that should have been there, and there is a lot to question about the miracles that they show. Some of them may or may not have happened, but in it, there were a few things that stood out to me when I rewatched it in preparation for these videos. And one was a speech in England that they showed Willie giving. And he said, "Temple blessings are only to be found in Zion. It is not a decision, it's a commandment of God." So even in church approved positive movies, they are showing that these people didn't believe they had a choice. If they wanted to follow God, they had to come to Zion. When he wanted Levi Savage to come and help them instead of coming home quickly to his son that he'd been already gone from for a few years, he said, if you help them, then the Lord will help you and watch over your son. So he was manipulated into doing this. I think he probably would have made the decision to help whether he was manipulated or not, because that seems to be the kind of man he was. But that is something that's still used in the LDS church today. When you are given something, a calling, or to go on a mission, or something that might take you away from your family, you are told that that service that you're doing will be a blessing to your family. God will bless your family for having you away from them serving. Whenever they showed somebody in the movie leaving early with their carts broken, or because it was hard, or because it wasn't what they thought it was going to be, they were portrayed as weak. There was a quote in it where someone said, "Some are weak, but we must be strong." The handcarts in the movie are not the accurate ones. When Patience Loader's father dies in the movie, she says, "Father fulfilled his vow," as if he had made a promise to die on the way instead of just saying that's what's going to happen. It shows Richards coming and visiting and even Levi Savage getting in trouble, but it doesn't show Richards taking the meat. And then at the end, they have some random woman dying. They don't even tell you who it is, so it's probably not a real quote. And she says, "It will all be worth it if my posterity will keep the faith." And that goes back to what I said a minute ago. We end up inheriting that obligation to these people, that what they went through will be worth it if we stay true to the faith. So if we don't, we feel guilty. And I guarantee you that that happens to almost everybody that has this kind of ancestry that leaves this church, because it happened to me. Right after that, another person said it will all be worth it. They show the young girl that dreams of a man that she's going to marry, and he's one of the rescuers. And she sees him and she recognizes the man from her dream. And so she does go on to marry him. They don't tell you that she ends up being his third wife in a polygamous marriage. In that movie, they also compare the death rate to other pioneers in westward migration, just like the church article does. It's just not true. And I wrote down all of the numbers that the church website gives. When I looked up the national average, the average for most regular pioneers and immigration, it was 2.5 to 2.9% death rate. And Mormon was 3.5. Even on the church website, it will show that the two groups were 8.1% and then the other groups were 2%. On BYU, that is owned by the church, they will give for those same groups 4.7% and 16.5%. So the numbers are completely different and much bigger than what the official numbers on the church website say. Countless books and movies and talks are out there that are only giving half truth and playing on our emotions. It's not fair. And it's not right. The heroes of this story are the human beings that went through these things believing that they were doing it for something that was true and that they felt like they had to. And not honoring that and telling the whole truth dishonors them in a way that no ex-Mormon ever has. Some of my last final thoughts on this series are these. When I talked about the Perpetual Immigration Fund, I sounded kind of negative about it, I think. And I want to make it very clear, I feel the same way about that as I do the Perpetual Education Fund that exists today. I actually have no problem with it. I think it's great. I think that if there were people that wanted to come here and they couldn't afford it, and other people could donate the money and it could pay for them to come, and then they worked back to pay that off, I don't find a problem with that. The problem I have is the interest, that they had to pay interest on it. Because especially if people were donating the money, that wasn't the church's money to begin with, and they're not a bank. And that's the same way I look at the Perpetual Education Fund today. If I donate money, the church takes that money and gives it to somebody for an education, and that person uses that to get an education they might not have otherwise been able to have. I think that's great. But if the church does not consider itself a bank, they should not be getting interest for that. Because technically, if my money goes to this fund and then that person pays it back, then my money has gone back in to help somebody else. And it can be over and over again, paying for people to get an education. But when they're charging interest, then the church is making a profit off of something that other people are giving. And when you think about the fact that the people that are giving to these funds also are paying their tithing, they're usually paying what's called fast offerings as well, which is money on when they fast on Fast Sunday every month, that they're donating a certain amount of money to help people with food and things like that. And then on top of it, they're giving this money, and then the church is making a profit. This church is sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars. The leaders of the church, their children and grandchildren get to go to college for free. So that is the problem I have with it. The second thing is these people were told by their prophets that they needed to come to Zion. So it was not the same as people who decided to immigrate west because they had dreams and they wanted to be somewhere. This is something that they felt they had to do. And they were pushed and they were told that they weren't faithful enough if they complained. They were told they deserved the suffering and the dying if they complained. The reason that I feel like this is a dangerous thing to keep talking about in the way that they talk about it, one thing that has always been talked about in the church is that when Jesus comes again, he's supposed to come to where the church taught the Garden of Eden was in Missouri, and that he would come first to the men in the church that had held leadership positions. So there are a lot of people in the church who have moved to Missouri over the years, believing that that's where the church will end up in the end when Jesus comes again, and they wanted to already be there. I know for a fact that most of the people I know in the church, if Russell M. Nelson got up tomorrow and made a statement saying that every member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the world needed to move to Missouri within the next 2 months, they would do it. Every faithful member would do it. They wouldn't think twice. They would sell everything they have and they would move to Missouri. That is how much power a Mormon prophet has. And that is dangerous. That is a dangerous amount of power for a man to have. So when I see Brigham Young and his part in this, I see that now. I see what happened to me when I questioned the leaders of the church, how people treated me, how people talked about me. I still see people following prophets because they believe in something. I think it's only healthy for people to understand that these prophets don't always make the right choices. Like I said, as I'm getting closer to Pioneer Day and I'm seeing people going on trek and I'm seeing people talk about the temples and the pioneers and all these different things, I have been disheartened to see this false narrative of these pioneers and making it into a story of the church instead of the story of the people. I hope this has been interesting. I hope you've learned something. If you want to get a lot of these stories I didn't share, pick up Devil's Gate. It is a really good and compelling book. He's a very good writer. He definitely did his research, and I highly recommend it. If you've made it through all 4 videos, I thank you for taking the time.